Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're discussing a case heading to the courts in British Columbia, challenging that province's vaccine passport program. This is a case that I'm involved with at the Canadian Constitution Foundation, and which I feel very strongly about. British Columbia has what I've called Canada's worst vaccine passport program. Vaccine passports, for clarity, refer to a government policy that requires a person to show proof of vaccination against COVID-19 in order to access certain public spaces like restaurants, gyms, museums, or otherwise public facilities. They do not refer to employer mandates. What makes BC's vaccine passport such a problem is that they have no workable exemptions, even for people who can't be vaccinated for a good faith medical reason. This is incredibly discriminatory and has had an adverse impact on people, for example, who've had rare adverse reactions to the first dose. Now, I want to preface today's show by saying that I support vaccination, and I believe most people can safely take the vaccine. I also believe COVID is a serious virus that's done terrible damage, and that some health measures are indeed justified and warranted. But imposing restrictions on people who can't be vaccinated for a medical reason is discriminatory, and it goes against our values as Canadians. It's why we at the CCF are challenging the policy in court. And here today to discuss that case is the lawyer representing the CCF and representing the individuals we're working with, Geoffrey Trotter. Geoffrey, thank you so much for joining us today. Now let's start by talking about the BC vaccine passport law, which as of right now is still in place in British Columbia. And the problem, as I stated in the opening, is that it doesn't allow for reasonable medical exemptions. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, so good to be with you, Christine. Now, our viewers should know that initially, when the BC policy was announced, the government actually said there would be no exemptions at all. So the CCF was involved in writing a letter very early on and pointing out that the Constitution required exemptions for those that couldn't safely be vaccinated. And so when the policy then actually came out in writing, there was some room for exemptions, but it was way too narrow. So here are the things that our clients complain about. The first is that the government has a closed list of the type of conditions that it will recognize for an exemption. So that covers the types of things that you've heard of, anaphylaxis to an ingredient in the vaccine and things like that. But of course, everyone's body is different, and there's any number of other reasons why someone couldn't safely take the vaccine. But if they're too uncommon to be on the government's list, that person's just out of luck. Second, the government doesn't allow doctors to write a letter that directly exempts their patient. What happens in BC is the patient has to apply to the government with a doctor's letter. So the government maintains a veto power. Thirdly, the government has basically called it fraud for a doctor to write an exemption letter for a condition that's not on the government's own list. And doctors are afraid of being disciplined by the regulator. And so there's just this huge chill factor. And lastly, up until last month, the only exemption you could get was actually activity by activity. You couldn't get a general blanket exemption.
So by activity, you mean, I want to go to dinner next Friday. I need an exemption for that. I want to go to my swim lessons on Saturday. I need a separate exemption for that. That's what you mean by activity?
That's right. So, you could apply for like a weekly class in general, but you could not get a blanket. So you're really treated like a ward of the state, asking permission from the government to go about your business.
It's completely appalling. Now, as you mentioned, a BC Chief Medical Officer, Bonnie Henry, originally said the province wouldn't have a vaccine passport policy at all. She said that it would exacerbate inequalities or inequities. But then a few weeks later, she did announce one, and it actually was this one that has no exemptions at all, which is worse than most other places. So in that time, in that few short weeks, what changed?
Yeah, so I think it was late May that Dr. Henry said she was not going to recommend any kind of vaccine passports in BC. And then from then until they were announced in late August, cases were at a fairly similar level, although perhaps you could argue the trend line was going in a different direction. But the main thing that had changed was really the political landscape. It was just a week before BC's announcement that the federal government announced a vaccine mandate for federal civil servants. And the BC announcement came just days into the federal election when these issues had all been politicized, and I think some other provinces were hopping on the bandwagon. But even if the rationale was entirely scientific instead of political, it still doesn't explain why you would punish people who can't safely be vaccinated by excluding them from public spaces.
Yeah, it's completely bizarre. Now, we've got to go to commercial break, but when we come back, I want you to tell us the stories of the individuals who are participating in this litigation, because they are some really compelling stories. We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing a case in British Columbia challenging that province's vaccine passport policy, which is still in place in British Columbia. It's a case that I'm involved with at the CCF, and we're discussing it with lawyer Geoffrey Trotter, who's representing us. Now, Geoffrey, the CCF brought this application with a few individuals. It's not just as an organization. There's a few individuals who are directly impacted. And I want to talk about their stories, what the impact of the vaccine passport has been on them. Let's start with the applicant named Erica. What is her story?
So Erica was 17 when she got her first dose last May. She's a lifelong competitive swimmer and a swim coach. She's received all her regular vaccinations. But unfortunately, she was one of those rare people for whom the COVID vaccine caused pericarditis. So that's heart inflammation. It's required hospitalization, lengthy period off work. She's actually had relapses of the pericarditis from subsequent illness after it was triggered initially by the COVID vaccine. Now, pericarditis is on the approved government list, but again, because of this activity by activity restriction, it's really an illusory exemption for a 17-year-old who's trying to remain engaged with her friends and her community.
And it's just insane to me that she wasn't able to get an exemption when it's one of the most clear-cut cases. There's another example to me in this case, a woman named Sharon. What can you tell us about Sharon's story?
So Sharon works in administration in a public school here in the Lower Mainland. She's received all her regular vaccines, and she received her first dose of COVID vaccine in May 2021 with everyone else. But unfortunately, she developed a severe neurological condition called brachial neuritis. It's inflammation of the nerves, in her case, to her right arm, which results in excruciating pain and close to paralysis. She became pregnant soon after developing the condition, and her doctors were not able to assure her that neither she nor her baby would be harmed if she had another dose and had further nerve damage. But despite all this, public health still told her that she ought to get it. But she decided she wasn't willing to put herself and her baby in harm's way in that way. And so, she's now had her baby just recently, but she can't go to a mom baby class at her local community center. She cannot go to a restaurant, with her other new mom friends. But because brachial neuritis is not on the PHO's list, she's just at a luck. She can't even apply.
So the issue is that brachial neuritis is a rare side effect, but it's an acknowledged side effect. And Sharon's doctors, what have they said about the relationship between that condition and the vaccine that she got?
Yeah, based on the timing and the fact that there's no other apparent cause of the brachial neuritis and no history in the family, they think that the most likely cause is the vaccine.
Now, Sharon's not an anti-vaxxer. Obviously, she went out and got vaccinated. I also support vaccination, but we also have to acknowledge that rare adverse reactions do exist, and they appear to have happened in this place. And it seems like this bizarre form of cruelty that the government would deny access to public spaces to a new mother who's also newly disabled. But that's not even the end of it. There's another third applicant in this case. Her name is Veronica. And what can you tell us about her?
So Veronica was born with spina bifida and hydrocephalus. So spina bifida means that her spinal cord, the main nerve, was not contained within the vertebrae of her spinal column. So it was actually kind of spilling out elsewhere in her body. She's had 15 surgeries over the course of her life, including one at 1 day old to put the spinal column back inside her vertebrae. She has fluid buildup in her brain that has to be drained. And because of her complex and overlapping disabilities, she concluded, based on that and other challenges she's had with medication that's been prescribed for her underlying conditions, and the lack of testing of the COVID vaccine on people like her, that she was not comfortable running the risk that she would have a reaction that just hasn't been discovered yet. Now, of course, her doctor was afraid to even write a letter in support of her based on the government's closed list and what the doctor's regulator had said. Now, in her case, apart from all of the other exclusions that anyone who can't get an exemption suffers, she's actually medically impacted too. The main type of therapy, physical therapy that Veronica uses is swim therapy. It takes the pressure off of her spinal column. She's got lots of physical challenges that go with her underlying nerve condition, but she's not allowed to go to her pool anymore since the orders were tightened up here in BC in December with Omicron. So she's not able to have her swim therapy. She's heavily reliant on medication now, and she's going downhill physically.
Wow, the government has said that these are all discretionary activities that are restricted, but in Veronica's case, it sounds like something that is quite necessary for her to have access to this pool in order to manage her disability. We've got to go to commercial break, but when we come back, I want to talk about the legal issues in this case. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing a court challenge to British Columbia's vaccine passport policy. It's a case that I'm involved with at the CCF, and we're here with lawyer Geoffrey Trotter, who's representing us. Now, Geoffrey, the CCF is challenging the policy. What can you tell us about the legal basis for the challenge?
Right. So there's two main arguments here. The first is that it breaches equality rights. It's discriminatory on the basis of disability. We also say that it's a breach of the security of the person rights. That's just based on the basic principle that everyone gets to exercise informed consent over what medication they're going to take, what medical treatments they're going to receive. And it's one thing to tell someone who can safely be vaccinated that they need to be vaccinated, but to say that to someone who cannot be safely vaccinated is really an effort to coerce them to do something that's dangerous in their own case for a greater public good.
Something that their own physicians have said. It's not their own judgment. It's their physicians are telling them. Although I think people's own personal judgment about their medical choices also matters. Now the government has said that since we filed this case, that they will now allow blanket exemptions for some people. So in Erica's case, it was activity by activity. They're now saying, oh, we will allow blanket exemptions. But did the regulations actually change? And if they didn't change, how are people supposed to know that they can apply for these blanket exemptions?
Yeah, so what's interesting is the government initially wrote me a letter after we'd filed this and said, really, your people should still apply for an exemption, and we give exemptions, more broadly than you thought. But I mean, people someone who has been told by their doctor that it's unsafe for them, they look at the order and the order says what it says. The form has a bunch of tick boxes on it and they're not on the list. But what's really upsetting about how this went down is this policy was enforced in September. It was further tightened up, in the ensuing months. It takes a while to get a court case like this together. We filed the case and all of our evidence in December. And it wasn't until after we had obtained hearing dates for this April 19th hearing that the government changed the order to say that now they would consider blanket exemptions. And yet their argument in their court papers is the case should be dismissed because now it's possible that they should apply for an exemption. And we want to say, look, it's way too late. The government shouldn't be allowed to wait till it's sued, wait till there's a court date, and then make some subtle adjustment to the order to avoid accountability to the court.
It's just such cynical conduct on the part of the government, in my opinion, for them to be behaving this way. Now, some of the concerns that the applicants and that we've had is that there are physicians who won't write medical exemptions because of that guidance that they've received from the College of Physicians, which seems to be somehow coordinated with the government. What can you tell me about the chill effect that has been happening and the difficulty that these patients that we're working with have been having in obtaining even letters in support from their doctors? Some have obtained letters, but some have had a real struggle getting those letters.
Yeah, so the only letter that our clients were able to get was for Erica because she's on the government list. But the others who are not on the government list could not convince a doctor to give them a letter, even though there was a recognition, particularly in Sharon's case, that this is most likely a COVID vaccine caused disability, and it's similar to other nerve problems that others have experienced. So I want your viewers to know that it was actually the same day that the PHO gave its list of what it considered, the closed list of conditions that would qualify, and when the BC College of Physicians issued a statement to all of its doctor members saying, hey, here's the PHO's list. You got to be really careful that you don't do anything that would be outside of that, and it could be considered, professional malpractice if you did that. So the timing is interesting. But our own clients have experienced this. Their experience was that their doctors and others that they saw said, our understanding is we're not allowed to write you a letter if you're not on the list. That's what our clients were told.
Now, one of what the government's responded to this. We've got about a minute. Broadly, what stood out to you in the government's response to our petition?
Well, the government did not give any evidence about why it would be problematic to broaden the exemption regime to address our clients' concerns. Really, most of the government's evidence is about why they think that a vaccine passport in general is justified. But that's not our case. We're not trying to strike down the whole regime. We're just saying we need an accessible, effective exemption regime for everyone that ought to be entitled to it.
And it's a regime that clearly has been excluding people who even fall within the government's really narrow category, like Erica, who developed that pericarditis. Now, we've got to go to commercial break, but when we come back, I want to talk about what exactly we're looking for the court to rule on, what outcome we're looking for in this case, because that's really important to understand. We will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing a case out of British Columbia challenging vaccine passports in that province for failing to accommodate people who have need medical exemptions. It's a case that I'm involved with at the CCF. Now, Geoffrey, you're representing us in this case. What outcome are you hoping to achieve?
Yeah, so we're asking the court to rule that the current policy with its inadequate medical exemptions is unconstitutional. Practically, that means it'll strike down the regime, but give the government a chance to redraft it in a way that accommodates constitutional rights.
It would be a great result for these individuals, although there's no recourse for the months that they've lost and spent in isolation. Now, the policy is ending. It's ending on April 9th, and our hearing is on April 19th. So interesting timing. The government has said they're phasing it out. So what impact does that have on the case, if at all?
Well, the government wants it to result in the case not being decided at all. They want to argue that it's moot. We're going to say, firstly, Dr. Henry herself has said that some kind of vaccine passport could come back in the fall when we're into the fall respiratory season. We've seen increases in cases both of the last two fall seasons. But generally, based on the fact that emergency health orders like this will always be either repealed or revised by the time someone gets them before a judge, it would really insulate government from constitutional review. And so we're going to ask the court to hear it in any event which it has the discretion to do to give guidance to government.
Yeah, I mean, it's very evasive of review for the government to make this claim. They're making a similar claim in the Emergencies Act litigation that I'm also involved in. Now, if this law is found to be unconstitutional, which is the outcome that we're looking for, would it have an impact outside of British Columbia? Might other provinces look at this policy and the decision and see it as a form of guidance?
Yeah, so it's not a BC decision is not binding on other provinces, but for sure, Canadian courts look to decisions in other provinces for guidance. We've seen that so far with all sorts of COVID decisions. And in general, as we've seen, Canadian courts have been really quite cautious about being seen to overturn, public health or government in terms of, what's seen to be essential, fast-moving public health protections. This is one of those situations where the facts are so bad that we hope that the court will call a government to account on this, and that if one judge does that, we're hopeful that in other provinces, other courts will feel that they have enough support now to start doing the same.
Now, in most of the other provinces, the vaccine passports have been repealed already. BC is lagging in that regard. But how did those other provinces, they could always bring them back in the fall, as BC has said. How did those other provinces like Ontario, Quebec, how did their regimes compare to British Columbia's?
So I believe BC's was the most restrictive. Certainly in Ontario, I know that doctors certainly in the early months were able to write direct exemption letters that were legally effective without needing to be agreed to by a bureaucrat. I believe that shifted over time because they were concerned about fraudulent letters, but surely the cure for fraudulent letters is to prosecute fraud. It's not to tighten things up so much that people who are genuinely ought to be entitled to an exemption can't get them.
Now, a lot of people are interested in this case. How can they watch if they're interested, and how can people learn more about it?
Yeah, so I'm not sure yet whether there's going to be a live stream for the actual court hearing or not. I know that the CCF will be on the ground here in BC during that case, making sure that the information gets out. So people should follow the CCF's website, theccf.ca, and they can donate there as well to the case.
Yeah, and I'm going to be on the ground with you. I'm going to be in court watching it, so I'll try to be tweeting out the developments as they happen from the courtroom. That's on April 19th and 20th, just in a few short weeks. Geoffrey, I want to thank you so much for all of the hard work you've done on this. You've been extremely diligent and are really doing a phenomenal job holding the government to account in British Columbia.
Thanks, Christine.
We've heard today about a case in British Columbia challenging vaccine passports for failing to accommodate medical exemptions. It's a case that's being brought by 3 individuals and by the Canadian Constitution Foundation, the charity that I work for. I obviously feel very strongly about this case, and I think that the treatment that Erica, Veronica, and Sharon has received from their government is cruel and reprehensible. Accommodating their medical conditions could have been done from the beginning and would have respected their basic humanity. Instead, we need to fight for them in court. But what do you think? What's your view on vaccine passports and about this case? You be the judge. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.